All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to get started. So welcome to our talk, Building to an Emotional Theme.
I am Patrick Weeks. I've been a writer at BioWare since about 2005. I wrote on the Mass Effect trilogy, including the Lair of the Shadow Broker DLC, that's downloadable content for Mass Effect 2, as well as, well, thank you, as well as Leviathan and the Citadel for Mass Effect 3. And after moving over to the Dragon Age franchise for Dragon Age Inquisition, I wrote for that. And after Dave Gator, our lead writer, moved on to another project, I became the lead writer for the Dragon Age franchise moving forward.
And I'm John Epler. I started at BioWare in 2007 as a term tester on Sonic Chronicles, became a cinematic designer on Dragon Age 2, and worked on Inquisition, all the DLC, eventually becoming the narrative presentation lead on Dragon Age Inquisition, or the Dragon Age franchise going forward. So,
if it helps, a lead writer, if this were a movie, I would be the screenwriter and John would be the director.
And it requires a lot of collaboration and iteration between the two of us. We work exceptionally closely together. So how can we help you with this talk? Well, we're known by and large for large character-driven interactive narratives. We generally try to make people feel things and occasionally succeed. And we can show you our process for doing so. So hopefully you'll come out of this with a better understanding of how we come up with our narratives and develop them. Now, a lot of vague examples and principles aren't going to be as much help as giving you something concrete to attach those to. So we decided we'd talk about the process we used to build the Dragon Age Inquisition Trespasser DLC. Now, as a warning, this was our final piece of DLC, so there are going to be spoilers in this talk if you haven't played it.
So before we jump into the Trespasser DLC, for those of you who haven't played Dragon Age Inquisition, or for those of you for whom it's been a couple of years, over the course of Dragon Age Inquisition, you started by helping to form the Inquisition, an organization devoted to restoring order in a world that was under threat and in chaos. After proving yourself, you became the Inquisitor, leader of the Inquisition. That was at least in part due to a mark on your hand that gave you the power to banish demons, a mark that some people thought meant that you were the chosen. At the end of Inquisition, you saved the world, restored order, and you turned the Inquisition into a major world power. Also, we left you with one big dangling plot thread in the form of Solas, your follower, friend, possibly even lover, leaving the Inquisition and being revealed as possibly the elven trickster god Fen'Harel.
So we had that as our baseline going into Trespasser, which means we had a very specific set of goals for Trespasser. We needed to wrap up the Inquisitor's story, and as Patrick mentioned, you had the mark on your hand. That made you the Inquisitor. We needed to remove that. We needed to take away the thing that made you this figurehead in the world. So conclusively tie off that protagonist story. We needed to set up the future of the franchise. We had a lot. The Dragon Age franchise has a lot of moving parts, a lot of narrative elements, some of which we didn't really bring in Inquisition. We wanted to bring those back, put them back on the table. So we had Illuvians, magic mirrors that let you travel long distances. We had the Qunari, an invading force from across the sea that hates magic. And we had the Ancient Elves, one of our franchise's biggest unsolved mysteries. They were a massive empire thousands of years ago that collapsed suddenly, and there's not a lot of history that really tells you why. We also wanted to do all this while emotionally engaging the players, or as we like to call it, giving you the feels. So how do we do?
Well, judging by the reactions on the highly scientific Reddit Dragon Age Trespasser reactions mega thread, we found that players were very interested and they felt that this was the ending that they were looking for. They did get the closure they wanted. They were emotionally invested in the possibility of hypothetical future games in the franchise. And we brung the feels. So how did we do that? We do that through a process, and the process of building to an emotional theme starts with vision. For us, vision is setting a shared target, something that everyone on the team can agree with as a goal that you are all going to work toward.
Next up is critique, and now getting everything in the game as playable as early as possible is hugely important because then everyone can give you feedback. look at the vision, and figure out where we're missing the vision or where we're not quite getting where we need to be.
From the critique, you move into revision. Revision gets you closer to your target. That's its goal. That's its only goal. Are you getting closer to the vision that you set at the start of the project?
And now there's a fourth step, which is repeat as necessary. You're very rarely going to hit your vision on the first try. And repeating the process over and over again gets you closer and closer to that vision. Now,
so let's talk about vision.
Yes, let's talk about vision. Patrick?
To create a vision, the first thing you do is set up your broad goals. These are the functional objectives, what you need to accomplish over the course of the piece of content you're looking for. The next thing you do after you've got your broad goals is figure out appropriate references. Now, to be clear, these appropriate references can be a movie, it can be a television show, a graphic novel, anything that anyone can use.
So what were our broad goals for Trespasser? Well, we touched on them a little bit earlier, but we needed to learn the truth about Solas. You as the player knew Solas was Fen'Harel, but that was a cutaway. That was a moment that the Inquisitor had not seen, so we needed to tie the Inquisitor's knowledge and the player's knowledge together. We needed to do this while giving you a sense of wonder about this ancient world, this ancient empire that had existed and fallen, and a sense of melancholy because one of your potentially closest allies was no longer going to be on your side.
Or boyfriend.
Or boyfriend. Closest boyfriend. Maybe not only boyfriend, but... And we needed to show the Inquisition had been infiltrated, which is to say, we needed to show that the organization had gotten so big and so ponderous that you no longer had direct control over most of it. Forces from within and without were corrupting it and twisting it into something it no longer resembled what it had been at the beginning. Which is to say, we needed to show you that simple solutions aren't. Just because you're the biggest kid on the block now doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. And honestly, maybe you shouldn't be the biggest kid on the block.
So once you have those broad goals, like I said, the next step is to figure out your appropriate references. Now, the first step in an appropriate reference, the first qualification, is it has to be intuitive. It has to be something that everyone understands. If I'm talking about this movie, I know what it means, and I immediately see how that applies to the piece of content we're making.
Now, intuitive is important. This is a great example of a scene that's been replicated in other movies. The original Battleship Potemkin is something not a lot of people have seen. So if you're referencing it, maybe choose something that's a little bit more common. Unless you're going to take everyone out to the theater to see it, it needs to be something everyone can get immediately and intuitively.
Second, it has to be inspirational. It's not enough that people recognize what you're using. If you're using this movie reference or that book, they have to see, oh, okay, if we're using that I remember this one fantastic scene in that movie. We should have a scene that kind of works to create the same feeling, and I bet here's how we do it. It has to make people want to use it. I will also add that there is a third thing we are not saying here. It doesn't actually have to be an objectively good piece of content. If I could segue for a brief moment, for Mass Effect 3's final DLC, The Citadel, in the final mission, you are retaking your Commander Shepard, and you are retaking your starship, the Normandy, from your evil clone. It made sense at the time. Our appropriate reference, our vision for that particular mission was Air Force One meets Face Off. Get off my plane meets which one of us is the real Castor Troy. These are not actually good movies in my personal opinion, but everyone on the project knew, okay, on that mission, that's what we're doing. These are the emotions we are going to convey.
And it's important to note that, as Patrick said, good is subjective, not objective, because I think those are both fantastic movies. There are a few things Harrison Ford has done in his recent career better than Get Off My Plane, so just saying. So for reference, we decided we needed two things, ancient mythology and an organization that had been infiltrated. Now, this is a reference that even if you haven't seen the movie, it's become so ingrained in popular culture, it's an easy reference to go to. Indiana Jones finds the truth behind the Ark, opens it, a bunch of Nazis get their faces melted off. Great. That is a strong visual and one that pretty much everyone's going to get.
Now, for the second part of this, an organization that had been devoted to good being corrupted from within by organizational overreach and infiltration by an external force, we went to the at the time recent movie, Captain America, the Winter Soldier, because what S.H.I.E.L.D. went through with the agents of Hydra, as well as its own good intentions, worked together to tell that the kind of story that we said, okay, that is the kind of story we want for Inquisition. So if you put Raiders of the Lost Ark plus Captain America meets the Winter Soldier, that gets us our overall vision. Now, that was the vision for Trespasser as a whole. If it makes sense, this is the macro level. This is the entirety of the DLC. You can also use visions for things at the micro level. Once you have this overall vision, you can go, okay, if that's the vision for the whole thing, what's the vision for this one dungeon? What's the vision for this one conversation, for this one scene? And that's what gets you a consistency of vision and a consistency of emotional theme across your entire content.
Now, for Trespasser, the biggest scene in the entire DLC was meeting Solas. You have to get to answer some questions. It was our equivalent of Indiana Jones opening an ark full of feelings instead of face-melting ghosts. Face-melting is a feeling, but not one we generally try to go for, So we needed to do a few things. As mentioned, we needed to remove your hand. We needed to take away the source of your power, of your authority as the Inquisitor, of the thing that made you marked by the divine. We needed to answer some questions we brought up in the main game. There were a lot of things that, hanging plot threads we left at the end of DAI that we needed to wrap up. And we needed to give players who loved, hated, or just really didn't care about Solas one way or the other a strong emotional payoff. So how do we do? Honestly, largely successful in that scene. This, to be clear, is the best case scenario. This happens rarely enough, but if you have an extremely strong vision, you can get there. If you look at the concept art in the previous slide, and then the actual scene in game, they're pretty close. And that's because we boarded this scene like crazy right at the beginning of the project. It was a consistent target for the rest of the DLC. This is also important. You have something that you know is going to change very little. Everything else in the DLC, all the plot threads before this scene and all the plot threads after this scene, tied back to this scene in one way or another. So it let us answer a lot of questions early without having to rebuild this scene from the ground up.
Now, if I could jump in for a minute before you change to the next slide. I think it's worth pointing out here that even in scenes where everything goes well, there are still tweaks and polishes, and it's still vitally important that you're using teamwork. The first draft of this scene, I wrote this, but the first draft did not have enough romance branching. It did not have enough specific content for players who romance Solas. And our editor, Corey May, a.k.a. Solas Mancer Prime, not only edited, but provided specific feedback. And at one point, I just told her, look, just write what will make you saddest, and then we'll say that I wrote it. Just write something that will make you cry. It's also worth calling out that another writer, Brianne Batty, she, while not hating Solas, she said, look, it's important that players who don't care about Solas have the option to have him start to give his big explanation and then say, you know, Solas, have I ever wanted to hear one of your big talks? No, never. And so Brianne is the reason we have that option in there. Even when the vision is on target, these little tweaks and these efforts from the team help bring it to 100%.
It's worth noting that any time I did work on the romance part of the scene, I would put it past Corey and say, is this making you cry more? If the answer was yes, fantastic. So that's vision. Now, because we had a specific vision early on, we didn't really need to go as deep into critique and revision. But even if you have the strongest vision in the world, sometimes you will need to go into critique and revision. And as an example?
So here is the Exalted Council finale. If talking to Solas is the climax of the Trespasser DLC, this is the denouement. Our vision for this was, if you remember Captain America, the Winter Soldier, after all the explosions are done, Natasha Romanoff, a.k.a. the Black Widow, faces a congressional hearing where a lot of senators have some very tough questions for her about S.H.I.E.L.D. That was the emotional inspiration we were going for. We wanted a bunch of politicians to be asking you tough questions about the Inquisition. We also knew this was going to be one of the toughest scenes because you were making a choice here. The choice between disbanding the Inquisition, an organization that you started and now lead, or keeping it but still seeing its power curtailed and losing a lot of its autonomy. In both of these cases, you're giving up power. And when you want the player to give up power, you need it to still feel like a win. You need it to still feel like something the player goes, okay, I come to this with a sense of pride. I come to this with a sense of ownership. So in our first draft, how did we do with pride and ownership? There it is. The critique every writer loves to see. So I aimed for pride and ownership as the feelings I wanted to invoke. How did I do? No. Here's what went wrong. If you look at the start here, you come into the Exalted Council meeting, and you have a bunch of politicians going back and forth. In the first draft, what you got was a single choice that let you say disband the Inquisition or keep the Inquisition. After you make your choice, there would be a couple lines of dialogue that were always the same, and then I would let you make another choice that let you say whether you were proud, angry, sad about your choice. Am I keeping the Inquisition and I'm proud of its accomplishments, or am I disbanding the Inquisition and I'm angry about what has happened and the politicians getting in my way? That's what I wrote. But here is what our playtesters saw. All they saw was, I've played the game for somewhere northwards of 50 to 100 hours, and the fate of my organization comes down to a simple binary choice with no emotion attached to it. What the what? This is not satisfying. This does not respect the player's motivation. And then, once they made that choice, it turns out that disbanding the Inquisition, I wrote it well, and players said, okay, that actually feels pretty strong. But keeping the Inquisition, the critique I got on my first draft was, it sounds like you're trying to have the Inquisitor say, no major changes, and that just never sounds badass. It is impossible for no major changes to sound good. So we took that feedback. I took that feedback. To be clear, this was my scene personally, and we rewrote it. Here's what we did. The first thing we did is we took, instead of the choice going from 2 and then you eventually split each of those 2 into 3 possible tones, we loaded the choice right there onto the wheel so that whether you were disbanding or keeping the Inquisition, you could see that you were going to have the ability to do it on your terms. I'm keeping the Inquisition, but I'm reluctant and I'm sad about the tragedy of realizing that we have overreached. Or I'm disbanding the Inquisition, but I am proud of our work and I'm going to go out with my head held high. This gave players the sense of pride and ownership. We also rewrote the entirety. We ended up rewriting all 6 paths. That was me, John Epler, and Mike Laidlaw, our creative director. We sat down at a desk and we wrote all 6 paths into what we were thinking of as mini epic speeches, each of which could give you a sense of pride and ownership. And that got us to what we eventually shipped, which our players were happy with and did find satisfying.
And despite all my efforts, I was unable to get off my plane anywhere in there, so. But I tried. The other problem we had with the end was not just with the end, but also with the DLC as a whole, and that was there's a lot of missing links. Tegan's arguments came off as petty. He shows up at the beginning, dumps a bunch of info on you, shows up at the end, and is basically a giant jerk. So we needed him to have justified concerns. He needed a reason to want you to disband the Inquisition. We never really gave him one. And we had multiple threads in this DLC. We had catch up with your friends. We had one last grand adventure. We had the Exalted Council. Nothing was really tying them together. We needed to connect those beats in a way that was more satisfying and, to a player, made more sense. So what did we do? Well, with Tegan was the first one. We gave him a lot more screen time. He started off with 2 beats, shows up, dumps some info on you, shows up at the end, and is an unreasonable jerk. And then we gave him 5. He shows up at the beginning, does a bunch of other stuff throughout the DLC, and also we showed through the gameplay, through the level, that your Inquisition was doing things without your authorization. They were acting autonomously, and honestly in a fashion that was pretty corrupt. So he went to just reasonable jerk instead of unreasonable jerk. And we justified his fears. We showed you that power does corrupt. And so for the various beats we had, we needed to make the transition from fun times to dire threat a lot cleaner than it was. Right now you have 3 competing plot threads. Let's combine them into one. So the dead Qunari shows up at the Exalted Council. Suddenly you have a clean transition from have fun with your friends. You click on that door and we explicitly tell you this will start the Exalted Council. There will be no more time for hanging out with your buddies. And then once you're in there, one of your scouts shows up and says, hey, there's a dead Qunari outside. And you, being the player and being a protagonist, decide, you know what, all this political stuff is boring. I'm going to go punch some people because that's what I do. Never mind that you are the Inquisitor at this point. And a bonus of this does give Tegan even more justification because you just basically turned your back on 3 of the most powerful people in the entirety of this part of Thedas. You've told them that, you know what, all this stuff about my organization is less important than me stabbing a guy in the face, so...
Now, actually, John used this slide, and there's an interesting little bonus you get when you have a strong vision and when you're using a critique and revision process that allows you to get closer to that vision. This is the Elven Servant. She's the one who points out the body to you, the body of the Qunari that starts this whole adventure. And at the end of the DLC, she is revealed to be an agent of Solas. She's revealed to be a spy. Now, this wasn't in the original draft. This wasn't in our first crack at this. It came out organically, and the way it came out was actually as a result of us using critique and revision. When you're doing these changes and going, okay, we're trying to get to Raiders of the Lost Ark meets Captain America Winter Soldier. How are we going to get there? How are we going to use this? Well, it turns out that we realized as we were fixing other stuff, as we were adding an additional scene here, as we were adding an additional moment there, we realized that, well, again, to take Captain America the Winter Soldier, I'm not sure how many people can quote note for note Computer Guy's speech about how Hydra has infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. and has been present all throughout S.H.I.E.L.D.'s history. But what can everyone say? What 2 words can everybody say about Captain America the Winter Soldier that let you know that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been corrupted? Hail Hydra. There we go. Yeah. Hail Hydra. This gives us our Hail Hydra moment. People have a hard time getting attached to big, long speeches, but a character is an easy source of emotional reference, and that's what players can glom onto. Having a character let us do that a lot more easily, and it was something that, again, we got in the process of fixing other problems because we had a strong vision. We had an emotional reference that we were going for.
So that's vision, critique, and revision. Ideally, this gets you where you need to be, but even with a strong vision, that step is the most important. You need to repeat this because every time you go down that path, sometimes you're going to take a wrong turn. For example,
the deep roads. Now, in a possible example of foreshadowing, the deep roads did not have a strong vision. What we had was a great palette, an art palette, the underground dwarven area. We thought it was fun. We hadn't used it a ton in Inquisition, and we wanted to use it more. We wanted to have the Qunari present. They were present at the end of our first dungeon. Our first dungeon, we use dungeon exchangeably just to mean a combat area that doesn't have a ton of talking and is a fairly linear experience. So this was our second dungeon area. It was supposed to establish the Qunari as a threat, and it was supposed to amp up the tension. Now, realistically, the only thing you do in the Dwarven Deep Roads is mine lyrium, which is our magical mineral in the Dragon Age universe. So we said, okay, so the Qunari are probably mining lyrium. Hopefully that's enough of a hook. It wasn't. It turned out that the dungeon had fantastic gameplay. It was really, really fun to play, but it didn't make sense. The Qunari didn't have a great reason to be in that dungeon mining lyrium, and what was worse, they didn't connect to the overall story. At the start of the dungeon, you knew that the Qunari were a problem doing something bad, and at the end of the dungeon, you knew that the Qunari were a problem doing something bad. There was no rising tension, and that was a real problem. We needed to explain what they were doing a lot more clearly, and we need to give them a reason to be in that mine gathering lyrium.
So one of the things we do is what's called tension graphing. Now, this is an arbitrary set of numbers. You take your beats of your story and you graph them out relative to each other. Now, orange is the deep roads. The problem is we had low tension, low tension, low tension, low tension. All of a sudden, you're fighting the Qunari leader and everything's going crazy. So we decided, no, you know what? We need to take the deep roads and up the baseline so the tension rises more gradually, because to a player, an experience that's satisfying is when that tension slowly goes up.
Then there was the writing side of it. And for anyone who has played this piece of DLC, please bear with me. So we thought about it. And we said, okay, what do the Qunari hate? Magic. They want to suppress magic. In the Dragon Age universe, the best way to suppress magic is with the organization called the Templars. So what if the Qunari were making Templars? Okay, that makes sense. Now, the only way to make Templars in the Dragon Age setting is to use lyrium, the magical mineral. So what if the Qunari were mining lyrium to make Templars? This actually works. This could bind the IP together. This could help things make sense. We added an information giver, a former Templar. We put him in the middle of the dungeon, and we thought, okay, he's going to explain that the Qunari are here mining lyrium to make Templars so that they can suppress our mages when they invade the south. This is going to make the whole DLC better. Or not. As it turns out, this took a ton of explanation, and when the playtesters being BioWare employees working on this project, they played this and said, okay, that was a lot of words, and I still don't really know what the Qunari are doing. So that was super bad. On top of it, we didn't have any Templars in this piece of DLC in a major way until now. So trying to add Templars to a story that already had the Qunari using magical mirrors to smuggle explosives into the political centers of Thedas and Ferelden in order to destabilize the area while you deal with political intrigue, your own governmental overreach, the worsening effects of the mark on your hand, and ancient elven mythology was possibly adding too many pieces to an already complex narrative. We needed something a lot simpler. We needed something that worked with the gameplay we had, because if you remember, the gameplay was what worked right in the first draft. So we took out the Templar stuff. It didn't make sense. What did make sense was the Saarebas. Now, a Saarebas is a Qunari mage. They were introduced in the Deep Roads dungeon as the end enemy of this level, and they were fun to fight. The Saarebas are suppressed, like all mages in the Qunari culture. And by adding this in, we could say, okay, this actually makes sense. They're ordinarily suppressed. They could use lyrium. So if we take the lyrium that the Qunari are mining, and they take the lyrium and they give it to their Saarebas, they're making super weapons. They're taking people who have been parched and dying of thirst their whole life and hooking them up to a fire hose to make them powerful. This is, by any measurable standard, a really bad idea for the Qunari, but that is the kind of short-term gain, long-term loss, dangerous deal with the devil that characters in the Dragon Age universe make all the time. When we added that, we got to a point where we were happy with that dungeon, and the story worked as well as the narrative, as well as the gameplay did.
It's worth noting that Patrick, though he likes to jump on the grenade of the Qunari Templars, that was a 45-minute discussion where we were convinced that we'd made everything in the IP tie together in some intricate, majestic way.
It was mostly my fault, though.
So a note is be wary of 45-minute discussions, because you can make any idea sound good if you talk about it for 45 minutes.
So that's our process. Vision, critique, revision. That is what gets us from our first draft to something that we are proud to show our players. When you have a vision, when you have a clear goal, that gives you a target. It gives you something that everyone on the team can look at as the same result, as the thing they are going for. And when they are critiquing, it gives them a point of articulation that works better than, oh, I don't know, this didn't just work for me, or risk of personal attacks or offense. It gives you a terms that you can use to argue intelligently. And it gives you grounds for less iteration to take from your first draft to your final draft.
And critique is hugely important. It takes useful feedback, and it takes place in a secure, confident environment. As Patrick said, it avoids personal attacks. It gets to the root of why it's not working. It notes both problems, and importantly, it notes strong things that you're already doing. If you have a moment that is really working, you want to build a critique in a way that addresses the problems but also supports the things that are already there. And it moves your project closer to the vision that you've established already.
So revision. Strong iteration takes you closer to the vision. That is its goal. And because it is not a random change, because you are moving towards a goal rather than just away from something that it doesn't work, there's a good chance that it's going to be kinder to your scope and your schedule. It's going to be kinder to your timeline. It's targeted changes for a targeted result. And most importantly, when those changes come in, you can test them to see if they work, to see if they do what you want and do get you closer to the goal. And if they don't, you can change them back or change them to something better. If I could offer one final takeaway here, I would note that we are all creative. Everyone in this room has more ideas than you're ever going to be able to fit into any of the games we work on. And because of that, we think of ideas as sacred and we think of ideas as important, and they are. They are precious. but they might not be right for what you're working on. An idea is only useful to the game you're on, to the content you're on, if it moves you closer to that vision. It's never worth undercutting the core vision of your project.
And you should listen to your experts and your testers. We have a large variety of viewpoints, of experiences on our project. There's a saying I really like. It's, if you want to make carve an elephant out of marble, you start with a block of marble and take out everything that doesn't look like an elephant. And these viewpoints, this feedback, that's the stuff that doesn't look like the elephant. That's the stuff that doesn't look like your vision.
Go into every project celebrating, rejoicing, proud of the fact that you are going to make mistakes. Making mistakes and going into revision is not a sign of weakness. Revising is a sign of confidence. It's a sign that you care enough to make your project better instead of insisting that your first draft was perfect.
And finally, take pride in what you build. Players don't care about the 1,000 terrible ideas you had on the way to the one good idea. They care about the experience that they take home, that they play through. That's what matters in the end, not how you got there, but what you got at the end. So I just want to do a quick thank you to all our fellow developers, everyone at BioWare who puts their heart and soul into the games we make, and everybody else here who makes games, who puts everything about themselves into those games.
We wanted to thank our families who put up with our late nights and our intense discussions about trying to get to the final draft.
And finally, we wanted to thank our fans who make this job worthwhile, make it worth doing. And so thank you to everyone here. You guys are why we do what we do. And quickly, there are two other talks you should see. Sebastian Hanlon doing a talk about Inquisition AI, Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the North Hall, and Karen Weeks is helping with the IGDA Romance and Sexuality Roundtable, Wednesday at 5, also in the North Hall.
So thank you all so much for coming. We will be available in the wrap-up area over there if you would like to come and hear about more things that were terrible ideas we fortunately caught before shipping that piece of DLC.
We have a lot of them.
Thank you.